It's my honor to be able to invite colleague and dear friend Rabbi Or Rose, the co-director of Circle, the Center for Interreligious and Communal Leadership and Education at the Miller School at Hebrew College and Andover Newton Theological School, to help us try to understand how do we respond to Isaiah's call, this powerful, powerful clarion call that comes to us as we're sitting in this moment of the fast when our bellies are empty and our minds are wandering. How do we respond to this moment, this pivotal moment in our history, when the prophet says to us and calls us to action by questioning whether the piety of sitting in the pews and fasting is enough while the world outside us is burning? The prophet says, "Do you call that a fast, a day when Adonai is favorable?" No, the prophet responds, "This is the fast that I desire, to unlock the fetters of wickedness and untie the cords of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break off every yoke, to share your bread with the hungry, to take the wretched poor into your home, and when you see the naked, to clothe them, and to not ignore your own flesh. That is the moment when your light will burst through like the dawn, and healing will spring up quickly." So I turn to these words and I ask you, Rabbi Rose, if you can share with those that are gathered here now at this moment, trying to figure out how do we respond and restore the historic allyship that the Jewish community once had in terms of its priority to civil rights, walking in the footsteps of Isaiah. How do we take a step forward now at this very pivotal moment? What would you suggest?
Thank you for inviting me to share a few thoughts. It's an honor. My understanding of this section of Tanakh is influenced by Dr. Shlomo Zucker, who draws our attention to the expression inui nefesh, which is used in different forms throughout this short but poignant reading. As he says, the key to understanding the text is to look at the ways in which the writer uses punning and redeployment of this expression, which we oftentimes translate as either denying or somehow abasing our souls or ourselves. More literally, it probably means something like denying our gullets. And what Zucker leads us to consider, I think, through his careful analysis is, broadly speaking, what does it mean to try and strive to live a life of integrity? Which is to say, what does it mean to try and take seriously, in rabbinic language, the classical categories of Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim? That is to say, what is the relationship that we hope to create between the study of Torah, our prayer lives, and acts of loving kindness? Furthermore, I would say in this moment, it's really important to think about the relationship between chesed and tzedek. That is to say, acts of kindness or acts of service and efforts at systemic change. You might also put it more broadly. What does it mean to try and live a life of kedusha? And returning to the text of Isaiah, I would say, first and foremost, are we listening to the voices of those closest to the pain? Are we listening to the voices of Jews of color in our own community? Are we listening to the voices of our neighbors and friends, those with whom we work, those we encounter in supermarkets, those who we might meet through clubs and teams? The other thing that I want to challenge us to think about is, might these voices actually be the prophetic voices we need to hear today? Because in the reading itself, of course, Isaiah speaks on behalf of the people. But can we move into a heart and headspace in which we recognize that the words of the prophetic can come from many places, and especially those that are experiencing the pain of injustice and inequality? And I would also say that in this regard and in this moment, we need to listen more than we speak. We need to listen clearly and empathically to the pain of our brothers and sisters. We also need to do our homework and to try and understand what it means to live in a context in which racism is systemic and is 400 years in the making. We also need to enter into a process of what the Hasidic masters call birur, of honest self-searching, of sifting and sorting and clarifying. And that happens both individually and on a communal level. What does it mean to think about tikkun hamidot and tikkun olam? To think about who it is that we are and we need to be individually. What are our attributes? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? And then how do we go about helping in some small way to mend and to heal the world? So those are my thoughts as I sit with this text now and think about it in the context both of the ancient call of the prophet, but also thinking about the cries of those in our communities, whether it's within the Jewish community itself or within the broader communities that we are a part of. Thank you.
And thank you. May we so be inspired to translate those powerful aspirations into deeds of chesed and tzedek. Thank you, Rabbi Rose.
Thank
And I want to welcome you to the next installment of Being Lights in Dark Times, Judaism and Civil Rights. As the world is on fire over the darkness of racial injustice across North America, the question we're going to explore tonight with another expert, activist, and teacher is how are we meant to respond as Jews? The prophetic tradition following Isaiah 49:6 is a very powerful clarion call that says we are all meant to be a light unto the nations, an or lagoyim. Not only do we follow the prophetic path of Isaiah, but we also walk in the footsteps of our teacher from JTS, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who marched with Dr. Martin Luther King in Selma. And so I'm very honored this evening to be able to introduce you to a very special guest, a colleague, friend, and teacher, and chaver of mine, Rabbi Or Rose, the co-director of Circle, the Center for Interreligious and Communal Leadership and Education at the Miller School at Hebrew College, as well as connecting with Andover Newton Theological School. I wanted to welcome you, Rabbi Rose, and hope that you might be able to share some insight, followed by some questions that people may have about how we can respond as Jews and as members of a Jewish community that historically have a deep connection to civil rights. How do we respond in this moment if we want to be able to follow through not only on the words of the prophet Isaiah, but also to continue marching forward in the spirit of Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Luther King?
Thank you. It's an honor to be with all of you. And you should know that I'm originally a Winnipeg boy. So I feel like I am coming home in some sense, a little closer to my roots in the Canadian Midwest. So to begin responding to your question, I would take us to Isaiah 58, which you and I just discussed offline. The great call of the prophet, which we read on Yom Kippur, in which Isaiah speaks about the usual assumptions related to fasting and to practices of mourning related to fast days. And of course, what he does in a beautiful and polemical way is to remind us that anything that we do in the sphere of ritual has to be connected integrally to how we live and work and engage with other people. And so in that context, of course, he's offering a critique and a corrective. The usual assumption, he feels, is that inui nefesh, to somehow punish or limit or somehow put one's self or soul aside, has to do exclusively with denying food and other pleasures of the body. But in a matter of just a few short verses, he upends that, so powerfully by saying it's also about displacing our own self-centeredness, whether it's through joy or through fasting and denial and thinking about the needs of other people. But part of what's so powerful about that text to me also is that it's not a dichotomous reflection on ritual or deeds of loving kindness, because he returns us to Shabbat and speaks very powerfully and very beautifully about the rewards that flow from Shabbat. So for me, it's a vision about wholeness. It's a vision about wholeness and a vision of integrity. And so I think that's a good place to start in this conversation. And as I said to you before, to me, I immediately think about what it means to examine ourselves in this season and to think about how we are relating to Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim, those three classical rabbinic categories of Torah study, of prayer, and of acts of loving kindness. And then to extend it one step further and to ask ourselves if we're already engaging in an honest reckoning about chesed, that is, acts of loving kindness, what is the relationship between that category and another foundational principle in Judaism, which is tzedek, which is justice? And what I mean to say by that is that on the one hand, every day we need to act in kind and merciful ways. And there are people that are immediately in front of us or may be hidden from us that we have to help, sometimes in small ways and sometimes in big ways. But we also have to ask ourselves, particularly in this moment of extremis, what is wrong systemically? Why is it that we continue as a society in North America to struggle with this disease of racism and bigotry? You mentioned Heschel before, and he once said very simply but very astutely that racism is an eye disease. We're dealing with the coronavirus now, and we're suffering from a terrible virus. But it's good to remember, too, that along with this pandemic, we're dealing with a much older kind of illness, which is racism. And so, what are the systems that have been put in place that allow for that to be perpetuated? More poignantly, I think we also need to ask ourselves honestly and lovingly, what do we do to participate in holding up those systems of inequality and of injustice? And to try and do it, I think, in specific ways that then begin closest to home and orbit outwards. So, for example, what is the place of Jews of color in our synagogues, in our schools, in our summer camps? Do those people feel welcome? Are they given opportunities to share their life experiences? Are they given opportunities to lead? And what are the assumptions that we make about who is Jewish and what it means to be Jewish and which lineages and traditions we turn to and why? And then orbiting outwards to think about the people that we interact with in different contexts. We are all people who are intersectional, which is to say, we participate in several communities simultaneously, and we play different roles in those communities. So again, when we think about the people of color or others that are marginalized in our communities historically, what can we do, whether it's big or small, to disrupt conversation and to try and advocate for change? And before I pause, I just want to say too that invoking the prophet Isaiah or invoking Rabbi Heschel, on the one hand, is incredibly inspiring. On the other hand, it can be very intimidating. And so what I would not want people to walk away from a conversation like this is to think that you have to be a Heschel in order to make a difference. I think it's also dangerous because we can look back nostalgically at a person like Heschel or the relationship between Heschel and King and pat ourselves on the back and say, well, we've been there, we've done that collectively, or he or they have done that for us. And so your question before still stands, which is how do we carry that legacy forward here and now? What can we learn from such individuals and from the context in which they lived and worked, and from the many people that they worked with and learned from? And what do we need to do here and now?
I think that's really sobering advice, and it's also very accessible. So I really appreciate you being able to break that down for us. Maybe before we turn it over for Q&A from the folks that are here, if you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit more about the work that you do at the Miller School with Circle in terms of the interfaith work, and then maybe if you wanted to mention a word or two about the wonderful book that you wrote that was primarily aimed for teens on the relationship between Heschel and King, notwithstanding what you said about not wanting to pat ourselves on the back, been there, done that. But you're also concerned as an educator about being able to train not only the next generation of teachers and preachers and activists, but also teens. So maybe you can reflect on both of those experiences for us, and then we'll ask people if they have questions, they can put them in the chat box or put up the hand emoji.
Sure. So let me start by circling back to that question about integrity and wholeness, because I think for me, one of the reasons why Rabbi Heschel is a hero is because he was a person that strove throughout his life to try and put the pieces together with integrity and in an integrated fashion. I'll just give you one simple example. When he famously said, after returning from the march from Selma to Montgomery, that he felt his legs were praying, what did he actually mean? I think that what he meant is reflective of his Hasidic upbringing, meaning that he understood that Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim needed to be intertwined. That by saying he felt as if his legs were praying, he was actually invoking in his own time and place the Hasidic notion of avodah begashmiut, that is, service to God through corporeality or through physicality. And of course, what he did, which was so bold, is that he understood that to enact that sense of the sacred, he needed in his time and place in the United States to partner with people from other religious and secular traditions. And he was very bold again in stating that he felt that Dr. King was the closest thing to a prophet that he had seen and heard in his day. So, what might it mean for us, to think about how our legs might pray? Again, it's not an either or choice, and that's really important. And that's what I want to try and communicate both to educators and religious leaders, but also to young people, which is to say, how do we put the pieces together in ways that feel more whole? And it's not making a choice of doing one thing to the exclusion of the other. And each of us, of course, has to also discover what our strengths are, what our talents are, and how we can participate given who we are as unique selves. But in doing that, I think we also, in this case, when it comes to racial justice, really need to think carefully about listening more carefully and more deeply, and knowing when it's our turn to speak and when it's our turn as allies to help promote other people and give them the opportunity to speak. Again, think about who is closest to the pain. The other thing too, which I want to say, which is often a complication in this work, is what Rabbi Harold Schulweis called one-downsmanship, the danger of one-downsmanship. That is, oi, we've had it so hard. And then someone else will say, you think you've had it hard. Oi, do you know what we have been through? And so, how do we build bridges of understanding and empathy rather than becoming defensive and saying, well, I don't have the energy or the wherewithal to deal both with this issue and with this issue. Yes, there is anti-Semitism and requires attention and intention, but there are other issues too. And in each of these situations, we're called upon to play different roles. And that's really important. One other thing that I'll mention, I'll come back to this term intersectionality, which is sort of bandied about and unfortunately is not oftentimes unpacked. But it's a term that was created several decades ago by an African American woman scholar, which is important to note in this context, in which she pointed out that each of us, as individuals and collectively, have different components of our identities. And depending on the situation, we either have power and privilege, or we experience less of those and more of oppression and degradation. And so, how do you bring those different parts of self and community to the table? It's going to involve inevitably times, of course, where we disagree strongly about issues. You asked me about my experience with other religious and cultural leaders and creating coalitions and such. I think one of the important things to think about is, why have we come to the table, as it were? Why are we here together? What do we hope to accomplish? And what are we not discussing in this moment? And what are we not going to accomplish now? And can we live in the tension of always working partially and not solving everything at once?
Hmm.
And assuming that we're not going to agree about everything. Why would we? Sometimes I find that that's really painful and undoes the potential for transformative work. We are not all going to agree about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and about what to do about homelessness in our neighborhood or in our city. And so, can we come together to the best of our ability and ask if we can solve problems? And that requires holding attention, and it's not easy, and it doesn't get easier for me. 2 decades into this work, because there are other issues that are more difficult and painful, and for which I want to advocate. But why am I here? And what is my purpose? And what can we accomplish together? It's not going to be everything at once. But the other thing, which is so important to this whole discussion, is, are we building relationships? Are we building authentic relationships? Are we listening to what other people are saying and feeling? It reminds me of of the story of the Hasidim who come to the Rebbe, on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, and they ask about a particular person, and the Rebbe says, "How is he doing?" And the Hasidim say, "We're not sure how he's doing," and he says, "Well, how can you pray together? How can you come together to daven with other people if you don't know what's hurting them?" So how do we come together communally, and really listen to each other, not so that we're paralyzed by the pain, but so that we understand just a little bit what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes.
Wonderful. So I want to make some space for some questions. I know that Talia, who's celebrating the anniversary of Bat Mitzvah, gets to go with a great question off the top because she's thinking Torah, as I'm sure all of you are. But if you have other questions, either signal on your emoji on the screen or send me a chat, and I'll take them all as they come in. But we'll turn to Talia, who has a question for Rabbi Rose.
Hi. My question was, in Montreal, like the Jewish community is homogeneous than in some other cities. So there's very little racial diversity in the Jewish community. In my Jewish school, there are only 2 people of color. I'm friends with one and I've reached out to the other, but this is very limited. What is the obligation on Jewish teens in Montreal to go out and find opportunities to engage people of color and give them the opportunity to speak and lead?
What a great question. Beautifully put. You must have interesting parents. So I would say that each of us lives in a particular ecosystem, and in each of those ecosystems, we have the opportunity to engage difference in different ways. So I remember, for example, growing up in Winnipeg, and in Winnipeg, there also were far fewer opportunities to engage Jews of color and um, people that identified, as Black, or what we would now call African Americans or Canadians. But there were many opportunities to engage Indigenous or Aboriginal people, who are also very tragically, as you well know, marginalized, oppressed, degraded in all kinds of ways. And so there was an opportunity to do some of that work, which is no less important. So that's one thing to think about. Who are the others in your neighborhood, religiously, socially, economically? Who are the people that are not given the opportunity to be seen and to be heard? Who you feel are not given a fair shot because the ways in which we've organized our societies privilege some over others. The other advantage, of course, when it comes to your particular issue is that you live in the age of the internet and of digital communication. So I think there are some powerful opportunities to connect with other teens, not only in Montreal, but other parts of Canada and throughout the United States and beyond. One other thing that I'd recommend, and this is not exhaustive, is also to think about how to bring some of these voices, the voices of teens, of people of color, other folks that are historically marginalized, into conversation with your community. That is, it's not the same as living together, but could we be enriched by conversations? Could we set up, for example, a monthly conversation group? Or are there particular speakers? Or could you read the works of great African American writers, poets, listen to the music of such people, and have a conversation with folks from that community in some way? So I think that is an interesting advantage, even in the midst of, or maybe especially in the midst of COVID, where it's hard to be as active as we might want to be, in terms of physical proximity and so forth. The other thing I'll just say on a small level is something that a friend of mine said this afternoon. I asked an African American imam, who's a dear friend of mine, what would he say to Jews that want to be helpful and thoughtful allies in this moment? And one of the things that he said that I thought was really powerful was, when I am not there, think about the conversation that's unfolding. And imagine if I was there, what you would feel comfortable hearing and what you would feel uncomfortable hearing, and how you might speak in constructive and disruptive ways when certain kinds of habitual patterns emerge, when we talk about those people or that group. And I thought that was really powerful, because it's not something that's gigantic, but it's something that's to do with the here and now. I'm in line for Kiddush, or I'm getting on the school bus, or I'm in class and someone is kibitzing and makes a joke that really is offensive, or, fill in the blanks. And, and we need to try and do so with a certain kind of loving kindness, with a certain understanding that we are all in progress. But can we be advocates for change in small ways too?
Wonderful. Paul has a question.
Yes, Rabbi Rose, one of the things that strikes me a lot when it comes to racism is it's always, the marginalized race that is battling against the dominants, the white people, the white Anglo-Saxons, or however you want to put it. But one of the things that I've also noticed is that minorities go at each other. more often than I think a lot of us really realize. But if you really pay attention to each community, be it Greek, Italian, Jewish, whatever, is that there always seems to be a conflict there. And I'm wondering what your thoughts on that may be as to why. Is it because you can't fight the big guy, so go after somebody smaller?
I think that's a really powerful and painful question. I think some of it does have to do with what battles we may think are winnable, um, and the size of the enemy. But I also think, to return to something that I said before, that in contexts where there are many people and many groups that experience pain and suffering in different ways, we want to be seen and heard and understood. And oftentimes, for a whole host of reasons, we feel like it's a zero-sum game. That if we make space for other people to articulate their pain, their suffering, that somehow ours will be diminished or will be sidelined, or that people won't take it as seriously. And
Like all lives matter.
right. So that has something to do with evolutionary biology and our basic need and desire for survival, but it also has to do with a whole set of social behaviors and patterns and aggressions and hurts and pains intergenerationally. So, can I say in the same moment that, we as a community are still very much recovering from the Shoah through the generations, and that African Americans also do not have the kinds of privilege, power, and opportunity that I do as a Jew in Newton today? That's again one of the tensions that we have to hold. It is undeniable that I have opportunities because people perceive me as white, and I can put on and take off my kippah to enter into certain spaces, to be heard, to be affirmed, in ways that my African American friends and colleagues do not experience. And at the same time, I also carry my own personal peckle of stuff, and my community carries with it some really painful stuff over the course of generations. And one doesn't cancel the other out. But we have a very hard time doing that. Practically, I would say to you, Paul, the more opportunities you have, both personally and communally, to enter into conversation with people that are different from you in ways that allow for honest and growth promoting conversation and joint action, the more understanding there'll be. There are no shortcuts. That's one of the sad parts about all of these flare-ups, because ideally we would be in relationship with people who are othered, who are experiencing pain in one way or another. We wouldn't be racing, now in the ways that many of us are, to try and connect. So can we build this as a practice? I dare say as a spiritual practice, that these relational practices require attention in the same way that we try and daven 3 times a day, or that we study Torah regularly. And what would it mean to say, as we prepare now, for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, I want to make, a commitment to engage interreligiously, cross-culturally, interracially, with a certain number of people this year. I want it to be a part of the focus of my synagogue community. I want to study something that's meaningful with other people, so that we learn to understand why they believe what they believe, why they practice in the ways that they practice, why it is that they find difficult some of the things that we think are positive or neutral, and to share with them the same things. But it does require work, dialogue, community organizing, require a set of skills and a discipline that I think sometimes we don't account for when we think about, what it means to live, the kind of vision that Isaiah or a Heschel, was calling us to live. So I hope that's helpful, and not too broad, but again, braiding your question together with Talia's, who in your neighborhood, who in your township, who in your school system, who is it that your children play soccer or hockey with? In my house, hockey is a very important part of our lives. And it's been an eye-opening experience to learn about certain kinds of difference. And the assumptions we make about other people and they make about us is sometimes astounding, in the year 2020, 21. It's something.
Thank you, Paul. I know we have two more questions, one from Joel Rappaport, Dr. J, and then one from Elisa.
What?
I need to unmute you. Okay, there you go.
Oh, me? Okay.
Hi there.
Dr. J.
Hey, thank you. Thank you. It was especially meaningful at a time like we've seen in the last couple of weeks. Just a quick comment, a couple of things. I've always viewed our devotion to change and to civil rights as being not one-downmanship, but the fact that we've been there. And in my life, I have been blessed to have not suffered a lack of civil rights, but I don't have to go back too many generations. And every year we remember vividly the times when we were in fact slaves.
Yes.
And more importantly, we remind ourselves that we should never forget the fact that we were once slaves, no matter how good things are. On the other hand, I think that our community has had their own issues in terms of dealing with the other, whether it be our own grandparents, perhaps, in terms of the way they viewed the other, or just last week we were going through the Parsha and we came across the point where Aaron and Miriam try and strong-arm Moses because he was married to the other.
Yes.
And in response to that, God gives Miriam what I thought was a perfectly wise and almost Solomon-type lesson where she was made into a leper for a week. And that gave her a chance to think about what it was like to truly be the other, because that's our classic other biblically. It's funny you brought up Isaiah, because I was, a couple of years ago, I did that Haftorah. and the thing that really touched me at that time was the fact that Isaiah starts off by talking about how God was angry.
Yeah.
And to me, we're living in a world where anger, especially over the last few years, has had far more meaning, and I find the whole concept of anger to be far more threatening. Mm-hmm. Because in my opinion, anger breeds impulsivity, and I don't think that we're a world that can handle too much more impulsivity. One of the things that I found, and I think I've always viewed Isaiah not as being an angry prophet. Okay. On the other hand, I've always viewed Dr. King as being at a time where nobody would have ever said anything against him being angry at that point. He was, in fact, not an angry man. And I think that's what makes him a true tzaddik, was that he realized that you should not let your anger and your impulsivity to get in the way of of your objectives. So I don't know much about Heschel, and my first question is Heschel, because you compared Heschel to both Isaiah and King, and I would hope that from the anger point of view, he's more like King than he was like Isaiah. Is that true?
So your comments are very rich, and let me try a brief answer. On the one hand, if we spend too much of our time being angry, then you're right. We can act impulsively. We can act in ways that are destructive and ultimately self-sabotaging. On the other hand, I think we all know that we need to occasionally and in thoughtful ways actually give expression to what is painful and even to our anger. So I want to read you something. It comes from a new friend of mine. His name is Drew Drake. And I asked him, in the context of a project that I'm working on the Book of Psalms for this time, because it feels like the Book of Psalms was written for such a time. I said, could you write something related to the themes of lament and praise? Because those are two of the central motifs in the Book of Psalms. So this is what he wrote. He's a fairly young African-American poet and actor. And it's called Searching My Rage. Today I let my rage be beautiful. Felt no need to dress it up. Did not care how it looked or what ground it shook. I just let it be, and it was beautiful. Today I let my rage be powerful. Left these hands to pray in a clenched fist. Left this face to smile with a tightened jaw. Took to the streets in strength and love to answer freedom's call. Today I let my rage be truthful. I let it tell me I was tired. Let it explain to me the term exhaustion. Let it rest, become my granny. Started saying stuff like, baby, close that front door before you let all the good air outside. Realize what a privilege it is to breathe this good air when many of my family members have died. Today, I let my rage be a sounding board. Let it listen to all the times oppression made its home in this body. Times where the road ahead grew into a fork in the road. Sometimes I question my choices. Other times I wonder why God seems to leave us such limited options. Today, I let my rage be joyful. My rage can sound like a soul clap, sound like Knuck If You Buck, sound like Cash Money doing it for the 99 and the 2000s, sound like Kendrick Lamar's All Right, but at the same time sound like Amazing Grace, like Lift Every Voice and Sing, like We Shall Overcome, sound like Hold On, a Change is Coming. And don't it sound like this rage is total praise? Today I let my rage be wisdom. Let it remind me of the family that came before. Remind me of the ancestors that made the brick I step on. Remind me of the bodies that were beaten on that mortar. Remind me of the resilience that sealed this nation together. Remind me that God lives in all of us, black, white, and every other color. How we make magic out of mud, communities out of clay, education out of emptiness, and like Isaiah, still rest on the seventh day. Today, I let my rage be holy. Let it be strong. Let it be quiet. Let it be still. Let it be a dance. Let it be a cry. Let it be a protest. Let it be a sigh. Let it be. And it was beautiful. I don't think that requires Rashi, or at least not my Rashi. And I raise it because, as I said, I agree. And how do we give ourselves and other people the opportunity to really cry out? And the question is when you do what and how you do it. And can rage become praise? And can you sing at the same time, as he says so beautifully, Cash Money doing it for the 99 and the 2000s, but also Amazing Grace, thinking about Dr. King.
But Dr. King never showed the rage.
Well, Dr. King showed a kind of holy impatience, showed great
Correct.
frustration,
Righteous indignation.
right?
But no rage. But no rage.
That I don't know. We could debate that point. But what is the relationship between expressing rage, right, and then transforming that into a vision of beloved community, right? Dr. King certainly took the prophets very seriously, right? And he understood that people had to give expression to what was painful. That's why he was such a strong advocate for nonviolent resistance. People needed to take to the streets. You needed to see them and hear them.
Yeah, that's it,
But
exactly.
but it required a certain kind of discipline and a kind of a transformative action. So, both psychologically and spiritually, I would ask us to think about when and where we do what. And I don't think we can skip over the steps, like in grieving, right? You have to be angry. You have to be sad. The book of Psalms to me is so powerful because the psalmists, whoever they were, aside from King David, give us permission to actually articulate a whole variety of feelings. And you don't have to get stuck on one. I think that's the danger, Dr. J, is if rage is all we feel and rage is all we can express, but how can it move like a dance, into other things? So that's
And
my not so short answer to you.
so let me ask you one short question. Today you've given these type of talks, I'm sure, throughout your career, but this is a very special time in terms of what is happening, in terms of how things seem to be coalescing, both in terms of having to deal with revolution versus incremental change.
Yeah.
I would ask you, what do you think Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel what sort of advice would they be giving those who are standing at the front of these demonstrations, looking at the horizon of our future?
It's always hard and dangerous to try and speak for other people who have passed and lived in different times and places. My intuition is that they would be very encouraged by the uprising of young people who are doing so nonviolently. I think that their holy impatience is something that needs to be seen and heard, and we need to spend more time listening to younger people. We need to glean from the wisdom of elders, including all of those elders, by the way, who are shut in right now and who have more limited access, to public life and will for the foreseeable future, because of the real dangers, but also to young people. Sometimes we give lip service to, phrases like continuity and empowerment, but we need to listen very deeply to these younger people who in many cases are leading these protests and marches and are saying to us, we need action now. And it's going to have to be sustained. But there are inflection points. There are moments, for a variety of reasons that we can't entirely understand, where things erupt. And and how do we respond? And how do we try and mentor and guide and listen and walk with and learn from, with as much love and discipline as possible. And one of the reasons why, again, Heschel is such a powerful model for me is it relates to what you said before. You can't understand Abraham Joshua Heschel unless you understand that he's a person that very narrowly escaped the brutality of the Nazis. He described himself as a brand plucked from the fire because he left Poland 6 weeks before the Blitzkrieg, in which so much of what he knew was utterly destroyed. And even as he was coming to the United States via England on a boat, and then when he got off Ellis Island, he noticed, who are the people carrying the bags? Who are the people that are waiting on us? Who are the people that are doing all of this physical labor? And as a person that was deeply wounded, he could have made a different choice. He could have turned inward and lived a much more insular life as a scholar and a rabbi, but he made a very deliberate choice. And he made a very deliberate choice, he says, when reflecting on his life, because part of what inspired him was translating his doctoral dissertation, which was on the prophets, into English and trying to rewrite it for an American audience. And he said, wait a moment. Here I am laboring over this project on the prophets. If I'm not involved in, the social struggles of the day, then what kind of integrity do I have? What exactly am I doing? I want the words of these ancient prophets to be alive in the, in the ears and in the mouths of people today. And so he changed course and became a much more active participant in the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement. And by the way, some of those choices were not popular, which is another thing, just to say that we sometimes look back nostalgically on figures like King and Heschel. Remember King's letter from the Birmingham jail. Why are you coming as an outsider? And why are you demanding that we take action so quickly? And so forth and so on. So I recommend that all of us reread that letter and wrestle with that part of King's legacy. King was
And
not,
I suspect he wouldn't be
widely popular.
a Wendy's.
Right. Pardon?
He wouldn't be happy with the burning down of a Wendy's or a police station.
No, he wouldn't. But he would call people to try and understand the pain and the suffering that led to that moment, and then how to try and redirect those energies, with great intentionality. So, I don't think that we need to condone negative and destructive behaviors. But I do think we need to think deeply about what leads people to certain kinds of actions, and are there ways for us to try and work collectively to redirect that sense of loss and pain and dislocation and debasement. But again, it's not one or the other. It's not, it's not up or down.
Or maybe that's when the rage starts to control us rather than we controlling the rage.
Right.
Let me turn to our final question. Lisa has one more question. I want to be mindful of our time. Mr. Koch, Lisa, you had a question?
Yes. Hi, Rabbi. I just, this may be a very naive question, but you talked before about meeting with people and giving them the opportunity to be heard and to listen to their story and sharing our stories. And you have a lot more experience with this than I do, but I'm curious, like I'm a little bit uncomfortable because I'm not sure how the other would react if I'm telling them, oh, I feel like I'm another, or here's my experience of being other, when they might perceive that their situation is much more serious or grave than mine. And I don't want to offend them by like trying to share a moment. How do you navigate that? Obviously it's different with each person, but how do you navigate that situation so that you can really connect on a soul-to-soul level without giving them the impression that you're diminishing their oppression or their otherness?
Right. I think that's a really important question. I'll try and be brief, so we can all continue our evenings with whatever else we need to do, including children who will come in and out of the screen shots. I think that, first of all, on a communal level, there are best practices in terms of creating structured dialogue and creating structured dialogue that have particular purposes and intentions. So, are you gathering to study? Are you gathering to meditate? Are you gathering to sing? And in each of those contexts, what might be the opportunity, for opening? What are the questions that we want to create together? Whoever is in a leadership position, whether it's professional or lay leadership, um, one thing to do, of course, is always to try and plan these things in partnership from the beginning with whomever it is that you want to meet.
Hmm.
So, with the best of intentions, sometimes, I've raced ahead and said, I want there to be a Jewish-Muslim dialogue, and then I need to ask myself, who is around the table, and um, what are we doing, and what is our shared vision, and mapping and planning and so forth and so on. Again, it's avoda. It's a real work
Hmm.
of spiritual service.
I
Uh,
was thinking more, sorry to interrupt you, but
yeah,
I know in the because we're running out of time. I was wondering more on an individual level. Like if we go out into the community, into our neighborhood, and we see and we meet, but on like a one-on-one basis, not as a community.
right. So I would start with people that you know, with whom you have some rapport and perhaps even some trust, and just say to them, "This is such a tumultuous time. I'm just wondering how you're doing. Can you tell me about what it's been like for you? Can you tell me what it is that you find that is giving you strength or solace?" Um, and then hopefully they can reciprocate. And I think that you're thoughtful enough and sensitive enough not to try and create false equivalencies, but if there's an opportunity to say, wow, that's really painful, um, that's similar or different from what I'm experiencing, then you begin to enter into, I think, an authentic relationship. um, I would also think about what is already happening in your neighborhoods, your townships, and your city, because oftentimes, we try and create opportunities, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we could be participants in it, and that might be a way to engage in something that's bigger than ourselves individually or even communally, and then meet people and enter into real dialogue, which can be carried out there and then, but which also can extend, to a Zoom conversation, or God willing, someday soon, a cup of coffee, or lunch in person. So I'd try and lean into curiosity and into empathy. And one thing that I try and practice myself, which is very hard, and I try and instruct other people involved in dialogue work, is when people are speaking to you and you ask them a question, try and spend the time listening to the question and to the answer before preparing in your mind your response. Because I think that's something that we do very, very often and very quickly. We hurry to formulate our responses, but can we slow down and just listen and take in? I think even in terms of our body language, it communicates something different. And then I think we'll be much more receptive and reflective in whatever it is that we say next. The last thing I'll say, which I always say too, is expect that you're going to step in it, because this is work. It's a practice. That word practice is really important. Like any other spiritual or ethical practice, meeting people that are different from us, trying to create relationships, trying to be allies, knowing when to lead, when to step back, when to speak, when to be quiet, you know, um, requires, ongoing cultivation. So,
Thank you.
that's my 2+ cents.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Rose. We have learned immensely from you, and we hope to take some of these aspirations, practices, and kavanot and forms of avodah into reframing the way that we live our Jewish lives. It's been incredibly inspiring, and we bless you to continue on in the holy work that you're doing to teach others, inspire others, and to make a difference. So thank you again for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. And let me say, a thank you to the people that are in attendance. And let me say in front of them, a thank you to you for being a friend and a colleague and a teacher and a mentor for a long time. And how beautiful it is, even when we don't speak, to be able to pick up, real and substantive conversation. That's a bracha.
Amen. Amen.
Take care.
You too. Sei gesund. Sei stark. Take care. Thanks again. Good night, everybody.